Welcome to Abounding Grace Radio. We are on location today at Christ Reformed Church in Anaheim, California, and we have with us Kim Riddlebarger, Pastor Emeritus, of Christ Reformed Church. So for those of us who are not Latin inclined, what does Pastor Emeritus mean?
I'm retired.
But you still hold your credentials.
I still have my credentials. I'm still a minister. I can do all the stuff ministers can do. Only I don't have to do them anymore.
You don't have a consistory breathing down your neck.
I don't have a consistory. There are no nighttime meetings, no classes, no synod. All the things that I would prefer not to have had to do, I don't have to do it. So.
But you're still active. We could talk about that. Yeah, doing a podcast now. What's the name of the podcast?
The podcast is called The Blessed Hope with Kim Riddlebarger, or Dr. Kim Riddle, whatever it is, because there's like 10 Blessed Hope podcasts, so I had the tagline at the end.
And you still teach Sunday school for us every week?
Teach adult Sunday school, yep.
Yeah, fill the pulpit from time to time.
Yep.
So
it's been a while, but yeah.
Yeah, we're grateful for your continuing ministry. Well, we thought we'd just kind of begin at the beginning with you. So tell us about your church background growing up here in Orange County. What generation are you? Californian?
I'm a fourth generation Californian on three sides. The only person I know that has deeper California roots than I do is Bob Godfrey.
Huh?
And he has an ancestor, I think his grandmother, who was in San Francisco for the earthquake.
Wow.
And of course the Godfreys are prominent in Alameda and park name for Bob's dad and stuff. So I think he's the only one that has deeper roots than I do. But I have I have 7 great-great-grandparents and 4 great-grandparents all buried here in the area. So
wow.
Deep roots here.
Yeah, and you come from a Christian family?
I do. I was raised in a wonderful Christian home. I have never not known what it is to be a Christian. We came from Grace Brethren stock, and they weren't. The Grace Brethren Church is an offshoot from the Brethren Church. The Brethren Church is pacifist, and the Grace Brethren were ardent dispensationalists. So even though I grew up in a home without the notion of the covenant, I heard the gospel from infancy.
And Grace Brethren, is that the one where they have a different man preaching?
No, those are the Simple Brother. Grace Brethren.
Okay.
You couldn't tell a Grace Brethren church from a Baptist church or an evangelical free church. They're very evangelical.
I see. So you had a designated pastor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we should mention that despite many years of faithful ministry, you do have what some might consider a disqualifying characteristic in that you're a New York Yankees fan.
I'm a New York Yankee fan. Yep.
How did that happen?
Quite by accident. Well, we had a Christian bookstore at Knott's Berry Farm. And Knott's, unlike other places like Disneyland, Knott's used Orange County sheriffs. So Orange County sheriffs would do security at what was going to be Anaheim Stadium. So my mom had been a big Hollywood Stars fan. My dad could have cared less about sports. So, good, Angels, coming to California, have our own baseball team. So the first year, I think the Angels were out on the West Coast. They played at Dodger Stadium. Huh. So my folks took me to Dodger Stadium to see the Angels play on June 20th, 1964. And it was Bo Belinsky against Jim Bouton. The Yankees took the field, and I was immediately a Yankee fan because I knew Mantle had retired, but Yogi Berra was the manager. Mantle actually played first base, but he could hardly move. He was as crippled up as I am now. Yogi was the manager. So they took the field and was like, I like these guys a lot better than those guys. So that started it.
So did that, was there much consternation amongst growing up in Orange County amongst your friends as a Yankees fan?
The Angels had just arrived, so there was really no fandom yet for Anaheim Stadium. As late as my high school years, like you could go to Anaheim Stadium and buy cheap seats in the top, and by the 5th inning, you could sneak down to the bottom and sit right by the dugout because there's nobody there.
They let you be a relief pitcher in some games if it was bad enough.
So it went from that to their World Series game. What, that was the 90s?
Well, they won in 2002, was it? With Socha?
Yeah. So after that point, that was the first time I recall going to Anaheim Stadium where the Angel fans would actually shut us Yankee fans down. That was the first time. So.
And no Dodger temptation.
No, LA's a long way. Culturally, they're not far as the crow flies, but culturally, Los Angeles is a different world than Orange County.
People don't recognize that.
Yeah, it's a big gap. So I admire the Dodgers, like the Dodgers, one of my favorite teams, but I like them more than the Angels, but it was American League, it was Yankees, and so Anaheim Stadium, for all the problems the Angels have, Anaheim Stadium's a great place to see a game.
Yeah.
It's easy to get out of. It's close, and so
Not a bad
I'll go
seat
see the
in
Yankees a couple times a year. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Grace Brethren, growing up, now, did you sense a call to ministry early in life? How did that come about?
Well, I never sensed a call to ministry until two other Lutheran theologians said you should consider it when it was in my early mid-20s. So I grew up in a family where we had a family business, so our life centered around running a Christian bookstore with all the ins and outs of Christian publishing in those days. I remember as a kid my dad talking about Old Man Zondervan. And he would cross country and go to Christian bookstores in an old Ford station wagon, and we'd buy stuff out of the back of the station wagon to sell in the store. So that's how far back I go. And Christian publishing was mostly sheet music, greeting cards. You had the blue hair, patron mostly. And then Knott's decided they were going to have to charge admission. And so that almost killed us, but we survived. And eventually they moved us out along Grand Avenue. If anybody knows Knott's Berry Farm, that's the shopping plaza. And we did well because they put 3 million people by my front door. So people would say, "What's your advertising strategy?" And say, "Turn the lights, open the door." So we did well until I was starting to have issues of conscience. I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't sell the T-shirts. And I'll never forget, Bob Godfrey walked in the door with a youth crew from Escondido, URC, with CRC at the time. And if you hear those pictures of Jesus and Bob walks in, it's like, I can't do this.
Wow.
So we closed the store in 93 or 94, 95, somewhere in there.
But when did you sense the call to ministry?
Well, I had attended the Simon Green School of Law, which was the startup law school here in Orange County. John Warwick Montgomery used to have a Sunday night radio show, which was the opposite of Walter Martin's Bible Answer Man. And Walter's Bible Answer Man was a must-listen water cooler show because he always was debating Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or something. So KKLA, not KKLA, it was KYMS at the time, had a big following for Walter's program, and on Saturday night, and then John Montgomery started a Sunday night program, and talked about starting a law school, and the law school would have a 1-year apologetics program. So since my dad had since died, my mom and I split the owner-manager duty. I had plenty of time, so I signed up. And upon graduation, Dr. Montgomery sat me down and said, "We'd like to have you come back to teach because we think you have an aptitude based on my master's thesis," which I had to defend in public, by the way. That was a trip. And he and Rod Rosenblatt pulled me aside and said, "We'd like you to go to seminary and come back and teach."
So no temptation to be a lawyer.
No temptation at all to be a lawyer.
By God's providence.
By God's providence. And upon the invitation, well, where should I go? Talbot's right up the street from my house. And Montgomery told me, "If you go to Talbot, the deal's off." So I did my 3 years at Westminster. I did the 2-year degree over 3 years because I had to commute. And upon graduation, I taught at Simon Greenleaf for a number of years and signed up at Fuller under Richard Muller doing my PhD. And then along the way, the White Hart Sin went on the air, and we started getting interest in a church that was doing this sort of stuff on the Reformation.
So at what point did you become Reformed then? And how did those two, I know about Rod Rosenblatt, not so much Martin personally, but how did they let you go to a Reformed seminary and not a Lutheran seminary?
Well, they told me to go to Reformed seminary. It wasn't a choice. I had been on the track toward becoming Reformed because a warehouseman at Knott's Berry Farm who delivered all our stuff was giving me all kinds of garbage about selling Hal Lindsey stuff. And I thought myself to be a young budding Bible scholar and I could answer anybody. He had me on the mat, just shoulders down, pin, you're out, all repeatedly. And that really bothered me. So I started to pull the skin back a little bit and look to see what was inside. And we were one day at the Old Christian Discount Bookstore over in Norwalk, which is the Reformed mecca of Orange County and LA County. It was the only place that sold Reformed books, like Cully in San Diego used to be.
Yeah.
So in the sale bin outside the door were 2 books. One was a Topical Index of B.B. Warfield stuff. It was on sale for $1. And I don't know why I bought it, but I did. That ended up being the basis for my doctoral dissertation because it had everything Warfield had ever written in it. But I also picked up a 5-cassette tape series on Tulip by Donald Gray Barnhouse. And after finishing that and wrestling with God and losing badly, having my hip dislocated, I started down that path. Went to Simon Greenleaf Montgomery, and Rosenblatt really encouraged me to become a Lutheran. But when they realized that wasn't going to happen, well, be Reformed. And because I wasn't a Van Tillian from the beginning, they were kind of amenable to having me back to teach when I finished Westminster. And I started under Muller. In the meantime, I can't remember the exact relationship of dates, but I ended up, got my home Bible study at the Cypress Evangelical Free Church, answered an ad for a Reformed Episcopal Church beginning in Orange County. And a Biola professor was going to be the key contact person. So we met with this guy, and this gentleman from my home Bible study, and met with this professor. He said, yes, there's this young man that's going to do the preaching for us. I would really like you to be part of it because you have a seminary education. And this guy had cat hair all over his doctoral gown. I mean, it's just one of those big, odd, eccentric types. And the young man was Mike Horton. So I met Mike when he was 18. We went to the first, I think it was the second service of that Reformed Episcopal Church. And it's Baptists doing the book on prayer, it was farcical. But Mike got up to preach, and my wife describes it as Clark Kent coming out of the phone booth as Superman. Here's this young man.
And he had the Jeff Foxworthy mustache then?
No, but he got in the pulpit and it was like, whoa, God's hands on this kid. So long story short, he ended up getting removed from the dormitories at Biola for teaching on Romans and ended up in our house. So Mike lived with us for a couple of years. And we went from the Reformed Episcopal Church, where both of us were originally ordained. The bishop saw that I had graduated from seminary, that I could actually accomplish things and run things. We had that time had probably 60 to 70 Biolans. And they were on the verge of leaving the faith because of the stuff they'd seen in evangelicalism. So we did apologetics over and over and over and over and over. And my wife finally pulled me aside and said, they're ripping you off. You can't. I was working swing shift and preaching Sunday morning. No pay, all that stuff. So she was looking out for my best interests. I ended up going to the Christian Reformed Church just down the street from my house after that. Mike went to his doctoral study, Westminster, then his doctoral study. So we came back, and Whiterson had started, and one night, it was an Easter Sunday night, we had invited Bob Strimple up to talk about the historical Jesus, because he just had written a book on it. And Mike and I were lamenting about all the stuff that the whiter sin had caused. We told him the story of a family that had been listening to whiter sin. I had left the bookstore to close. I'm working at the Cure office at the time. That was the organization. And I was talking to these folks on the phone every Monday. They'd listen to whiter sin and talk about the horrors of their church, how awful it was. They weren't doing any of this stuff. So I sent them with the local Reformed church bodies. I won't say which one. I won't say which congregation. And they called the next Monday and said, that's the worst church we've ever been to. And I kind of a deadpan. No one spoke to us. They acted like we weren't there. And I said, well, here's what you do. Find somebody who's up front during the service. Go talk to them afterwards and say, hey, we're new to all this. Can you help us? So they find this person, turns out to be an elder, and they say, hey, we'd like to take you out to lunch and ask you some questions. I'm sorry, we don't go to restaurants on Sunday. We're Sabbatarian. Never invite them to their home, never said, just cold as ice. They walked away, never came back.
Sadly, that's not uncommon.
So we explained that to Strimple, and Strimple teared up.
Wow.
And said, you guys have this many people interested in the Reformed faith. These are Christ's lambs. You must feed them. And since Mike and I had done a church plant together once before and swore we were never going to do it again, Strimple looked at us, and I looked at Mike. We made eye contact. It's like, we're doing this again, aren't we? Without having to say a word. The collective unconsciousness. So that's what led to the start of Christ Reformed Church.
Yeah, and this year is 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah.
So, and about 2 years before that of prepping.
Wow.
We just didn't open the doors. We had a committee that planned well in advance what to do. We were still in the CRC, and they cut us a big check, and we were going. So
they actually had a decent development.
They didn't like anything we were talking about doing. They were pushing me to go to Rick Warren's church planners boot camp.
Wow.
And I filled out the form and sent it in. And I wanted the money to go back to Princeton, work on my PhD. They were not amused. And so Christ Reform started in October of 96, I think.
So what were some of the obstacles in those early days getting off the ground?
We had the biggest group for an opening Sunday that they had had in years. So it wasn't lack of interest. The Whitehurst didn't really generate a lot of interest in the church.
Yeah.
The obstacle was Christian Reform church planting. They could not understand for the life of them why you'd want to have a church that did weekly communion, a Reformed liturgy, stress Heidelberg Catechism for your evening service, and no contemporary stuff. They just absolutely could not understand for the life of them why you want to do that.
Historic Reformed ecclesiology.
Yeah, so we met them at the Whitehorse Inn office, and Shane Rosenthal, who for a long time was the Whitehorse Inn producer, got into it with them about the contemporary stuff. He said, you guys have to understand what you consider contemporary is like what my parents listened on the FM radio station. My stuff's grunge. Yeah. And if you start in that contemporary cycle, you're never going to get off. You're going to always have to keep up with it. And they got into a pretty good argument, and it spread. There was a lot of spittle coming out of mouths, veins on foreheads, but it was principled. It wasn't an fight. It was an argument. And the CRC pastor in charge of home missions looked at us and he said, man, I was raised in a church that from the time I was born till the time I left in my early 20s, I got married, we didn't see one single person convert to faith in Christ. We didn't baptize a single adult convert. I don't want to ever be in a church like that again. So I get the motivation. I mean, the motivation is pure of heart. They want to see people come to faith in Christ. I get that. But they were going to copy Rick Warren to do it. And there's nothing worse than an ethnic Dutch Reformed church trying to imitate Rick Warren. It's like, they just can't. They can't get it. Yeah. So we told them we thought the numbers are going to be good, that we could make a go of it. And lo and behold, they cut us a check.
So you started out in the CRC.
We started as a CRC congregation.
The wars.
In the midst of the wars.
That was a wild time to be CRC. Tell us about what was going on then in the CRC broadly.
Thankfully, Colossus Los Angeles ended at the Anaheim Christian Reformed Church. So since we were on the other side of Anaheim, we were in Colossus South, which had more conservative churches concerned, Escondido, URC, Chino, Ontario. So those were our kind of mentors. And we ended up with the first Sunday with a good turnout, thankfully. And Mike preached, I think. I can't remember how it worked, but Mike did a lot of the preaching early on, and I would lead the liturgy. And it wasn't long before we were actually able to, we had an escrow account from our 2-year startup. We were able to raise the money to pay back the CRC's home mission gift to us. And Andy Camming, who was the pastor at the Escondido Church, said, you're going to pay that back over my dead body. We've been paying money to that fund for years and saw nothing come from it. So we ended up paying the national body back, but we didn't pay back Colossus California South. Because the pastors were all, no, we gave money for that. You're not paying that back. That's what our contribution is. So we were the last church into the CRC and the first church out. Wow. So when those 4 churches left, we had no real commitment there. And we had, I think, 1 negative vote to stay. And everyone else was out to go. So we were gone in Cal South.
The primary issue of women in office?
The primary issue for our brothers and sisters from the 4 churches was women in office. And the other issue was the problem with classical visitors. Because classical visitors, it was an elder would come to your classes meeting. 2 elders would come from different classes to supervise or to watch your classes meet. And if stuff was done they didn't like, they could veto it. Wow. Which is why we don't have that in the URC. And we were talking about not only women in office, but authority of Scripture was a real issue. Because many of those arguing for women's ordination were also thought Paul was a troglodyte, patriarchal beast. And we're not, Jesus and Paul were speaking different languages, sort of thing. You've heard that before. Yeah. And so there was a lot more going on than just women in office. And these guys had been sending money to pay for Calvin College, which was teaching evolution. There was all the rest. They were done. Yeah. So it was easy for us to leave, and we were the first in, last in, first out.
And you didn't have the maybe personal draw to stay in the CRC than
No,
being new to the denomination.
It was easy for us.
Yeah.
I didn't have a ministerial pension to worry about.
Right.
Some of those guys give up everything to leave, and
Yeah.
their health insurance, their pensions, all of it.
Wow. So then how about the decision to come to the URC? Was there any?
Well, we ended up going to a group of concerned churches in the late 90s. And there were probably 10 or 15 CRCs ready to go that day. And out of that started the URC, and it was like a 2-year startup for them before they finally stood up and said, we're done, we're out. And we were in that group initially that came out.
Was there any talk of uniting with the PCA, the OPC, any other?
Not at the start. The Canadian Reformed Church is a sister, but so different on covenant at the time. That was of some concern. And that became a bigger issue and led to the non-merger over time. There was a small splinter group called the Orthodox Christian Reformed Church that were 7-day creation and 7-day only. And we didn't really fit with them because we had some framework and old earth guys, and they wouldn't have that. Yeah. They've since moved into the URCNA, but they weren't happy about where they were, and they couldn't. It wasn't sustainable, so they came in. So the big issue was we wanted to be a Reformed church using the historical liturgy, law, gospel, distinction in preaching, redemptive historical preaching, week of communion, and catechism and liturgy. And our brothers in Chino and Escondido, Ontario were not quite sure they wanted to do that, but they were okay with us doing it and supported us.
Yeah. So what were some of the tough aspects being in an early fledgling denomination like that?
The real problem for us was the fact that no one knew anything about what we were doing. We had a couple of CRC elders, and we had good relations with Rand Lankeet, who was the pastor of the Interior Church at the time. The rest of us were out of evangelical Bible churches, and classis was foreign. The whole idea of classis, synod we could kind of understand, but it took a while to kind of get the sense of the culture. The ethos came easier, the Heidelberg ethos, because everyone was so thrilled about law gospel at that time. It was so new and exciting that came easily. But being a Reformed church was a bit of struggle. Most of the new folks joining Christ Reformed at the start were ex-Calvary Chapel, and were not used to an elder visit. That was a frightening thing.
The Gestapo showing up at
yeah,
your
it's
house.
like, we look in your drawers, see how much hooch you have. And of course, they didn't know that was a tax. They were looking for your hooch to take something.
Yeah. So that's an interesting spot to be in, a new church plant in a new denomination. Did you ever wonder if this was going to work?
You always have self-doubt, because you had asked earlier about a call to the ministry. I was still thinking I was going to be a professor. I always thought Mike Horton would be the pastor and I'd be the professor. I'm wired more like a professor. Pastoral stuff was much harder for me than it was for Mike. I'm more organized and administrative, which Mike, I'm a little ahead of him on that. So I always thought I'd be the professor, and in the classroom I thought Mike would be the pastor. So it was really tough for me to learn how to be a pastor, and I got a lot of the sharp edges knocked off early on.
And so for young guys who might be listening, how did you know that would be your call and not being a full-time professor?
It was backwards. I had an external call before I had an internal call. The external call was people saying, you should do this. I had a bishop and the Reformed Episcopal Church tell me that I should be a pastor because of my ability to preach and teach. And then in the startup group, it was pretty clear that, you're going to have to do pastoral things and so over time it became, initially it was like wearing my shoes on the wrong feet. And over time it gradually changed to where, the Lord is really softening a lot of the hard edges, and I started to feel more and more comfortable.
Yeah. So you just kind of see which door God opens and you walk through.
Well, for me, that was the case.
Yeah.
I didn't have a strong pastoral call. I had a strong call to teach. And then preaching kind of came easy. It wasn't hard because I'm kind of organized and I'm not afraid of logical and that kind of thing. And but I really had to work hard to become a pastor.
So maybe a good lesson for young guys not to have your future chiseled in stone. Be be malleable, be liquid, and able to adjust on the fly to whatever door God opens for you.
Well, that's exactly right. I fully expected to run the family business, and when Montgomery and Rosenblatt said, "We think you ought to come back and teach," I about fell off my chair. I had never, ever once considered that. And then when the Reformed Episcopal Church started over in Cyprus, the bishop said, "We think you ought to, accept the role as the first pastor of this congregation." So it's always been an external call, and thankfully it's been confirmed. The Lord's blessed what we've done. So
yeah. So what were some of the bumps in the road in the early days of the church plant, either in the church or in the denomination of the URC?
Well, I'm thankful the bumps were good ones. There were bumps, but it was hard to assimilate the interest at first. It had been like, I don't want to say a flood because it wasn't that big, but it was certainly a large interest in what we were doing from White Horse Inn. And when the lights came on and we started having services, we were overwhelmed pretty quickly we had gone from a startup committee to having 200 people the first few services. And we didn't know how to assimilate them. The poor Ontario elders were like, "This is what you do. You have to do this." It took a while to kind of get the rhythm of.
Did they give you elders? How did that?
They would have an elder visit every Sunday.
Okay.
And then we had a core group of 4 or 5 guys. One of them, who's still here, Ron Renee, really had wisdom in knowing what to do. And it was a good group of strong elders. I would not have been able to say to the constituents, "Let's do this." That just wasn't going to happen. And
no yes men.
No yes men. And it was good for me to have accountability. It was good for them to have a teacher. So it was a good relationship. And I've never once had a time, a sort of bump where I felt like that there was going to be conflict within the consistory, the church body. That never happened.
So how long before you had your own elders?
We particularized after 8 months.
Wow.
So it was really fast.
That's warp speed.
Speed.
For people who are listening and are unaware, that's not your typical church plant situation where you have 200 people after a few weeks and then you're particularized after 8 months. It's usually much more of a grind.
Yeah, it is. It's a much more of a grind. And it's largely because of White Horse Inn.
Yeah.
And Mike Horton's a great preacher, frankly. And it was wonderful to hear Mike when he was just starting out as a young kid. Just had working his way through Westminster and done, and just starting to preach. And there was a lot of excitement, enthusiasm, and it's a unique period in time.
How did you divide the preaching and teaching between the two of you in those early days?
We did by Mike's schedule. Okay. Mike was starting to do postdoc at Yale, and then when he had finished that up, he would be in town once in a while, and so I preached when he didn't. And then when he returned from Yale, Westminster called him to take over the chair of apologetics and systematic theology. So then in you go, and that was me. Yeah.
Was that a bit of a surprise, a shock for you?
It was, well, I'm going to stumble around because it really wasn't. Yeah, it was pretty clear that was going to happen.
Okay. So you weren't wondering,
no,
why am I left with the bag?
No, it was mutual. And
we were a dynamic duo, and now we're solo.
Yeah.
Was that a bit of a difficult transition for you, being the solo guy then?
Dan, it was very natural. There was nothing in the first few years of Christ Reformed that was problematic or weird or confrontational. It went very, very smoothly, which is just a sign of God's grace because we were bumbling around not knowing what we were doing. So maybe ignorance is bliss.
Yeah. Figure it out on the fly.
Figure it out. We got tossed in and we swam.
So what were some of those things you mentioned, not maybe being pastorally inclined in the early days? What were some of the things you had to learn?
Sick calls.
Yeah.
My first one, a young man had taken ill with some sort of an internal parasite or something. He was pretty sick. Wow. And I went to visit him over here at one of the local hospitals, and his first reaction was, "What did the doctor say?" "What do you mean?" "Well, what did the doctor tell you?" Because the pastor had come, he thought he was dying.
Whoa. So you're about to give last rites?
Yeah. So evangelicals have not had experience with sick calls. So the pastor coming to see them in their sick bed. So he was terrified. He thought I was coming to arrange the date or whatever for him. So that was hard. It was hard to see people in pain and gentleman that had been a church member here for years had had an open heart surgery, and he'd had a staph infection in his incision, and he was just writhing in pain. That was hard for me to how to help those. Counseling was a little bit easier.
Well, just with the sick, what advice do you have for young guys starting out, maybe pastors who are new to caring for the sick?
Find a deacon or an elder in your church who's good at it and go with them.
Wise
and
counsel.
One of the things that is also really important is if there's a wife of an elder, the elder and the wife can go together. Women have an ability to really soften some of the difficult stuff.
Yeah.
And if it's a woman who's ill,
Right.
your wife goes with you and goes in the room first and prepares the person for the pastor.
Yes.
Yeah, there's just and an elder who's done that, a pastor's done that, can really be a great asset in training and warning about the kind of accidental things. You don't want to walk in somebody who's,
Right.
Doesn't want to be
bedpan.
Yeah, doesn't want to be seen or in an awkward moment. And women are really good at that kind of thing, or they tend to be nurturers, and I'm not a nurturer by definition at all.
Did you have a kind of a general outline you would follow or script?
No, I would always read a passage depending on what the illness was, how serious it was. I think you have to treat people. I tried to make it a habit of preparing separately for each thing, so I didn't get in the rote habit of just doing hey, I'm here, here's the prayer, see ya.
Right. Yeah, drive through.
The shortcut. Ministers are busy, so it's a natural default setting to follow the same thing over. And I'm really wired that way to save time. I'm a huge time manager. It's the one thing I came out of college with, the importance on, making every second count kind of thing, which is really bad for ministers because you make people feel like you're hurrying. And
right.
So to counteract my natural propensity to be that way, I made an effort to approach everybody kind of fresh. And I'm glad I did. It was one of the ways I knocked off some of the hard edges. The Lord knocked off some of the hard edges.
Yeah. I do like to end on the side of brevity with caring for the sick, though, because I tell young guys, the last thing you want to be is the pastor who hangs around too long.
Yes.
People are in the hospital, they feel terrible, and you're just hanging out all day, and they wish you would leave.
Unless they want to talk, then that's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
But, it's like Job's counselors. They were really helpful to him, but they didn't say anything.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's another thing I'll tell young guys is, or counseling, especially around a funeral or something, we're not going to have amazing, eloquent words of wisdom. And even if we do, people probably won't remember it anyway.
Right,
But
right.
your presence, they will remember.
People are grieving. They just want to hear the gospel, be comforted. Weddings are a whole different story, but but funerals are pretty straightforward and easy.
So what other counseling things did you have to learn?
Well, part of it is I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time doing marriage counseling because at the time we had a really good Orthodox Presbyterian regional pastor for the OPC, and he took our folks and he was worth his weight in fine gold, which spared a lot of pastoral time. I think with counseling, it's really helpful to know the Dirty Harry's line, a man's got to know his limitations. And there's some things I am not able to help with, and I would farm those out to local area counselors, especially things like depression and those sorts of things that involve much more than, here, read this verse and you'll feel better tomorrow.
Right.
I can offer biblical counsel. This is what the scripture says about marriage and this issue and that issue, but I tried not to do marriage counseling when it was stuff like communication or stuff in the past. I mean, when people have habitual practices, I wasn't really good at helping with them with those sorts of things, but I could give them the law and the gospel and absolve them of their sin and give them counsel from Scripture.
Did people in those early days coming from Calvary Chapel backgrounds, mostly you said, was there some growing pains with Reformed theology? Was there buyer's remorse for some of them after they'd been involved in the church for a while?
Yeah, there was a fair bit of buyer's remorse because when they discovered church membership, that was a big issue. I have to say yes to this. I have to allow...
Yeah, because Calvary Chapel, for those who might not know, does not have church membership.
No, you show up. So that was difficult to be a member of a church and to sign on the dotted line.
Take vows.
That was tough. The other thing was elder visitation, as I mentioned. That was a foreign concept to many. And then the theological rigor of it. I think the catechism was helpful for some. For others, it was the thought of, I have to do this all the time. There's just kind of a, not a libertine spirit, but a independent spirit about Bible church evangelicals. They don't want to be tied down to one particular thing.
Yeah.
And they're used to going to this study, to that study, or the other. So it was hard for them to make that kind of a commitment for some.
The a la carte approach is common in evangelical.
And when you have a big wave of people coming in, you pick up some of those people. The other thing was hard when you had people who had theological differences, such as there was a large contingent of Reformed Baptists. And it was hard to tell them, you need to be somewhere else. We love you. You'd be great here. We'd want to have you, but it's not fair to you or to us to have a fundamental difference like that. We'll help you find a place. And thankfully, there was a really good Reformed Baptist church up the road a bit.
Good.
And we would steer people there because we're just not going to over a long haul. It's just better to have people of like mind than to make the gate a little too wide on those marginal issues that become conflict later on if you don't nip it in the bud.
Right. So you were able to have one foot, though, in the seminary world, even though you were a full-time pastor. Tell us about that over the years.
Over the years, I was asked to do sabbatical relief. So there were a couple times I filled in for professors when they were in their sabbatical, so I preached and taught. And then when I retired from Christ Reformed, I taught the sem for 3 years. And that was a big adjustment because had I gone to the seminary right out of my PhD program, it would have been a much easier transition than to have to go back and catch up on a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And that was good for me too. That really stretched me and knocked some of the cobwebs off.
Did you find that doing the teaching on the side contributed to your pastoral ministry?
Yeah, it really did because it prepared me to deal with students. And we had a lot of students here. We've graduated a lot of folks from here to the seminary.
Yeah.
And that's a real blessing. But to think of students as a different sort of audience than I had here on Sundays kind of stretches you a bit and enhances your ability to communicate. And you have to think about your audience and what can they understand and what can't they understand. And it was a younger group generally. And one of the things that you're going to discover as you get older, all of a sudden you're not able to communicate to the whippersnappers like you could when you first started. So
the cultural references fall flat.
One of the criticisms of my 3 years after here was someone wrote that they were tired of my dad jokes. Like, touche.
Well, let's talk about retirement then. When did you start thinking about retirement?
Well, I had
Don't
always
say day one of
day
pastoral
one
ministry.
We had a very difficult disciplinary case, and I realized that I was so predisposed to be ornery. My attitude about it was really bad.
Yeah.
It was one of the difficult things about church discipline. So many of the cases are people do things to themselves that they shouldn't do, that are just, what on earth were you thinking?
Yeah.
As opposed to somebody who's in rebellion. The rebellion type cases are a little bit easier emotionally because somebody's not doing what they're supposed to do in a rebellious way. This was just dumb. And it involved the authorities and other issues, and it was my attitude was not good. And I realized I was done. You can't minister to people if you're just mad at them.
It was that stark of a realization.
Yeah, well, it'd been coming a long time. And about the same time, I had heard that our dear buddy Mike Horton was going to cut back a little bit on his schedule, so he asked me if I would want to fill in. So it just was a natural transition. I always had wanted to teach at the seminary, so I was able to end my career doing that, and that was a natural thing. But as you know, the ministry is difficult in that you're out 4 or 5 nights a week, and that starts to wear on you.
Yeah, and driving all over Orange County.
Driving Orange County.
Not easy.
Not easy. And then just counseling cases where the issues are just, it's not as though somebody's broken and needs help. Those are easy. These are folks who are just doing ridiculous stuff and self-justifying and kind of contentious. And after a while, I got to the point where it was like a sunburn. You know, somebody touches your summer, and I just got to where I don't want to do this anymore.
So how did you prepare then for your retirement?
I took a year off. I told the consistory that I was going to retire in a year and stepped off the consistory. So the church would learn to function without me. And I think that was useful to them and to me as well. And I wanted to be as distant from the leadership of the church as possible while still using my teaching gifts, so it would make a nice spot for whoever came after me.
So you weren't dead set on handpicking your successor.
No, I have my flaws, but one of them is I'm not a micromanager.
Yeah.
I do my best, and I'm emotionally able to say I've done my best, and that's it. I'm finished.
Was it difficult to take your hands off the reins?
No.
Wow.
No. Because I was going to the seminary.
Yeah.
It went from I retired in December. I was teaching in February. So there was no time for thinking about things like that. It was just,
you can't sit around and get grumpy or whatever.
I got to take over a Christology class. I got a lot of stuff to read. So my sense was I got to get to the books and get prepped for that class.
Yeah. So
there was no odd sense of, gee, this is the last time I'm going to do this. And I have always wanted to teach at the seminary. So I didn't leave on bad terms or reluctant. I left for something I've always wanted to do, which made the transition a lot easier.
That's great. So what advice do you have for ministers? There's quite a few men in your age bracket now who are pondering retirement. What advice would you give to those guys?
You have the sense of when it's time and when it's not. I mean, that's an individual decision, and it's financial in part, realistically. It is how your family's going to be impacted. It's by where you're going to go to church. There's just a lot of things you have to kind of factor in. And hopefully you've been in a church where your church is taking care of you well, and if you can retire.
Yeah.
And that's huge. A lot of men are not able to, just fiscally, and have to stay on. And I think you'll know when either the Lord opens the door for you to do some sort of retirement. There's lots of things ministers can do in retirement they can't do while they're active. Yeah. And there's a lot of opportunities there. And if you are attracted to those, that's one thing. Health is another. You know, I got a little bit of arthritis in my legs and knees, and I'd come home from church and I hurt. Yeah. And so there's just some of that. And there are a whole bunch of factors that go into it, but the Lord made it very easy for me to do. And I think it was, since I'm the only pastor the congregation had known up to that time, it was time for me to go. Mm. They needed to be rid of me. They needed you.
Well, so how did you transition then to doing the podcast and everything? What was that like starting up?
I've always been a Paul guy. My PhD was under Richard Muller, who's a historical theologian, but he went back to Calvin, so I had most of my class time with Don Hagner. So I've always had an interest in Paul and his letters, so New Perspective was something I burned under my cell. I wanted to tackle that. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of tough questions in Paul's letters. I just finished the Baptism for the Dead and Speaking in Tongues. I take a controversial view of that. So those are all things that are kind of my hobby interests. Mm-hmm. So on a podcast, I can just sit and do that. I've done radio for 27 years. Right. That's easy. So
it was not difficult for you to get behind a microphone.
And it keeps me from chasing neighbor kids out of the yard and from yelling at the sun and all that other stuff that retired guys do. It's something to do that I like doing, so I can do the research and record and edit. And it's kind of like a hobby. Yeah. I don't feel stress from it. I can do it in the middle of the night or early in the morning, and I enjoy doing it. So it's a great way to use my gifts in a beneficial way that I actually like doing.
Yeah. And you still teach Sunday school for
and
us?
Sunday school for you. Yep. So that's always a blessing.
We're very grateful for that. So
happy to do it.
Even though you're not full-time anymore, you're still serving the kingdom with the gifts that God has given you, still being used to bless people, and we're grateful for it.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
Yep.